Okay, so this is a recording. I'm doing this on the 11th of April 2021. And there's many things that I've been wanting to write about, and I often don't get around to writing about things. And people talk about writer's block, and I always just thought it was some sort of thing where a person just, couldn't get the energy together to write, or was feeling tired, or just didn't want to sit down and write. And I'd always sort of thought that that's what writer's block was, but I've kind of started to think, oh, well, I suppose writer's block can be many different things depending on what people's issues are. And so now I can claim my stuff as writer's block. Sometimes I haven't written stuff because when you start to write radical ideas, which a lot of my ideas are, some people might criticize them, and maybe you feel sure about your beliefs, but maybe you don't really want to get into justifying it all. Or to be criticized for having those opinions, because some people will like what you have to say and some people won't. So that's one thing. And then the other thing is expecting somehow that nobody's going to be interested. So it's like, why bother writing stuff if nobody else is going to read it? So it comes back to self-belief and self-esteem and all that sort of, and worth and value and importance. It's like if you have that feeling for whatever reason that people aren't going to pick up your stuff. I have that feeling, and I think I've got this expectation that people are going to think my stuff's boring and they're just not into it. And it could be true. And the other thing to keep in mind is that you're not actually writing to a bunch of people who are convinced that something like socialism is a good idea, because there's a lot of people out there who think for different reasons that something like capitalism is better, or they've been, in my opinion, they've been fooled into believing a lot of the lies about capitalism, like that it generates more, income for everyone, or that the trickle-down effect, that if you give lots of money to the rich people, it will trickle down to the poor people, whereas in fact a lot of billionaires will just come and invest their money in something else that may not actually benefit people so obviously. It's like if Jeff Bezos keeps making billions and billions of dollars all the time, then obviously those billions of dollars are going to him and not to anyone else, not to his staff, who apparently have some really terrible things going on. So anyway, I'm digressing there, but the point is that, I've often had that feeling of people won't be interested in my ideas. And you see, we do live in a world where a lot of people are very vacuous, because that's part of the culture and that's part of the what happens. I think what happens is that there's a lot of socialization that goes on towards selfishness and thinking about your smaller community. So a lot of people are like into taking care of their family, or taking care of their town, or especially taking care of their country, but not actually being concerned with other countries. And if people had more, so anyway, I think this is something that I'd like to talk about for a little bit. So I might just say, so I've kind of come to this point where my writer's block is kind of coming to an end, because I don't need to worry about writer's block. I can do voice recording because it's easier. And then, of course, the stuff that I've done as voice recording, people, if anyone in the world was possibly interested in my ideas, of which probably nobody is, but, who knows? That's the thing. You kind of think like you're the only socialist-minded person in the world, but then you hear things, like you see things about voting. I think it's something about being isolated too. And maybe because people have different ideas, if your ideas become radical, I think you do isolate yourself off a bit. And I also find that I don't tend to congregate around other people with socialist ideas because a lot of people, I might be the same, but I've never belonged to a particular party because my ideas do change. But a lot of people who belong to different socialist and other groups, they kind of got very fixed views on things. And views about what's right and what's wrong, or what's correct and what's incorrect, what's progressive and what's not progressive, who's good and who's bad. And I don't like that because I like to have a more open mind towards seeing the good in every situation and seeing the bad in every situation. Not bad as in morally bad, but, maybe not as effective. So it's like we've got to keep an open mind. So I guess I'm just deciding that I'm going to talk about stuff, and then if people want to listen to it, they can. And I guess if enough people started to listen to these ideas, then they could get written down. I could write them down, or someone else could write them down. So there's no reason not to say express your thoughts and your opinions if you can't be bothered to write about it. Just talk about it. So here I am. And I think that the thing I just dwelt on about the focus of Westerners is such a valid topic in the world that we live in today, because, we've got the situation where a lot of progressive ideas have emerged in Western countries about black rights and also about women's rights, and the Me Too movement and a lot of that stuff. And a little bit of me gets sort of cynical about it because I keep seeing these opportunities for the system to sort of swish it under the carpet by, new rules for the police so that the violence does diminish, and that's brilliant. But what if, generally people of colour continue to be massively exploited economically in the world, which is currently the situation? If we're talking about fighting racism, it's not just about police brutality. It's about, the violence of, if you want to think of it that way, of an economic system which denies people access to all kinds of fundamental rights, so, and not just people of colour, because, once you start to go into the history of humanity, it's all about one group against another, and it's not always race. It could be ethnicity, different regions or countries. It could be, but the same sort of similar race in terms of genetics of appearance. But, it could be people who are vastly different. It could be different religions and all this kind of thing. Or, sexual identity, But it's like any opportunity to divide. And we've got to become more aware of all of that and see how it gets used by various leaders, and realise that, the things that are going on in the West are minuscule compared to the violence that's happening in the third world, and we're in particular talking about people of colour, but especially people with African heritage, because it's like all the places where people are black and African heritage, either in Africa or in all the places that they were taken to as their ancestors were taken to as slaves, these places are generally the poorest places in the world. You've got a lot of poor places in Asia too, and it does stretch down into Latin America too. But I've been told that the further south you go, the more wealthier and whiter the South American countries become. So, it's almost like up around Central America and down into places like Ecuador and Peru, the people are more South American, Indian looking, not, all Spanish or German like the Argentinians, And so, there's a poverty thing connected to wealth there too. But it's like people can't afford, in many countries struggle to get enough money for food. Often people's have medical problems that go untreated because there's no money to buy the medicine, and there's no free medicine because the governments don't provide it, and it's maybe it comes through charities, or United Nations or something like that as a, emergency assistance, or maybe it doesn't at all. And it's like, that's not the right way for the world to be organised. And then you start to look at other issues that sort of connect to it about, general poverty and wages and lack of them, and lack of rights to unions. And it's all this exploitation of the third world where, people of colour, Asian, South American and African, in all these places are being exploited for their, cheap wages, lack of freedom, lack of rights, terrible governments with limited resources, either because of corruption or because the country's poor and they can't afford anything better. But even in these poorer countries, there seems to be super rich families that have control. So it's like these are all the things that we need to become more aware of, and we need to be speaking out about the fighting of racism is about the fighting of economic injustice for people all around the world. And so if that's what we're going to do, we've got to take it up that step. It's not just about police violence, it's about standards of living, access to healthcare, access to medicine, free medicine, good education for the children and for the adults too, if that's what they want to study, more staff, and that it shouldn't be about who can afford it or who can't. And, reasonable clothing, reasonable housing, that all people have it, that reasonable food, of course, it should be a standard given across the world. And when people were born, when all of us were born, none of us were ever asked at any point in our lives, do we want to live in a capitalist world, or do we want to live in some sort of socialist world where everyone has the basics provided for? I think that if everyone had been asked that when they were 10 years old, they would have all said we want some form of socialism. We don't want some sort of government control where we've got no freedom, but we do want the basics taken care of. And that's how it is in Western countries, except for the United States. They're a different case. There's a complexities to that country, especially to do with its history of slavery and the keeping of black people there poor. But in other countries, it's usually been, especially where there's a white majority colonial group, then that country has a good standard of living, because as the working class improved their situation and their rights by the end of the 19th century in Western countries, they then started to have these basic standards that came into rules, especially after the Depression too. And so then people had, workers' rights and union rights and standards of wages and access to government resources. And it wasn't just that rich kids went to school anymore, all children got to go to school. But of course, all those sort of resources have been best enjoyed in the most prosperous countries, which also happen to be the most European countries. And if you're living in a country like Australia or New Zealand, then you have a really good standard of living, and the indigenous people by default have access to a lot of that stuff too. But then there's also massive impacts from colonisation, which causes all kinds of issues and health issues, and in Australia particularly exclusion and standards of health challenges, stresses and traumas from tribal disconnection and things like that.